From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm David Feldman, along with the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Steve Scrovan is in Toronto, Canada, working, so I'll be working solo today with Ralph. On today's program, we're going to be talking to longtime anti-nuclear activist Harvey Wasserman, who helped coin the term no nukes. And we'll also hear from the corporate crime reporter, Russell McIver, in our regular feature, The Corporate Crime Reporter Minute. Now, a few weeks back, our regular listeners may remember we spoke with Fred Stokes from Mississippi about how factory farms are not only abusing family farmers, but also compromising the quality of your food. This week, we're going back to the farm. This time, we're going to start by talking about where our food comes from and your right to know where it comes from, which brings us to our first guest, Richard Oswald. Richard Oswald is a fifth-generation Missouri family farmer who lives on the farm in the same house where he was born, situated in the Missouri River Valley near Langdon. Mr. Oswald writes a weekly column titled View from the Cab for the Progressive Farmer and authors Letters from Langdon to a multimedia rural news source called The Daily Yonder. You can visit that site by going to thedailyyonder.com. Among many other positions Mr. Oswald holds in the family community, he is president of Missouri Farmers Union and also serves on the board of directors of National Farmers Union. Welcome, Richard Oswald.
It's great to be with you.
Yes, thank you again for coming on the show, Richard Oswald. I have in front of me the latest issue of the Organization for Competitive Markets. It's a newsletter devoted to advancing competition, which would help family farmers survive and thrive. They are now being squeezed by giant suppliers of their materials like the seed companies and fertilizer companies, and they're squeezed on the other side by the giant buyers of agricultural products like Archer Daniels Midland and Cargill. Cargill being probably the biggest private corporation in the world. It's as big in sales as Ford Motor Company, and it has no public shareholders. Richard Oswald, you are a fifth-generation family farmer in a society where tens of millions of people spend hours every day in virtual reality looking at screens. It's very gratifying to have somebody on the show who actually produces something, who makes something that's very useful for people. You grow soybeans and corn and other products. Could you tell us a little bit, before we get into consumer dimensional issues in terms of food and farmers, tell a little bit about your farm, the size of it, what you grow, how it got underway, and whether you use GMO seeds or you use traditional agronomy.
Well, the farm where I live is the farm that was my parents' farm, who I inherited it from, is a 176-acre farm on the Missouri River bottom. So it's a big, broad valley where I'm at. The valley's about 5 miles wide, and it's bordered on the east by the Luss Hills, which are famous both here in this part of the country and through Iowa, as well as similar Luss Hills that are in China. And it's bordered on the west by the state of Nebraska, and the topography changes there to hills. So it's a broad expanse of land that's got hills on either side of it. My family first came here in about 1845. My great-great-grandfather, Enoch Scammon, on my mother's side, immigrated across country from Maine, and his family originally came from Scotland and Ireland, and he settled here. And so some of the land that I farm, and I farm it with my son, who's the sixth generation in the family, some of that land is land that has been passed down through the family from Enoch Scammon, and that's owned by my cousins, and they allow us to farm on it. We grow GMO soybeans mainly because that's about the only kind of soybeans we have a market for here. We've chosen to grow seed beans because it gives us a greater premium, a better price. There's not much alternative right now as far as marketing is concerned in this area. The corn we grow is specialty corn that's used for food. Some of it is GMO and some is non-GMO. And interestingly enough, seed companies have recognized the fact that non-GMO corn suddenly is possibly a little more valuable than GMO corn because the non-GMO corn seed we buy actually costs more than the genetically modified types. So the corn we grow is both white and yellow corn and waxy corn, and that's used in all kinds of foods from corn chips to corn starch and cornmeal and all the things that people eat, sometimes in fast food and sometimes prepare at home.
And what is the advantage of GMO soy compared to non-GMO soy? And the same for GMO corn.
I've been a critic of Roundup Ready soybeans since before I planted them. When we first planted Roundup Ready soybeans, we found that they were much more prone to mold and other diseases than the non-GMO beans. We also found that our yields decreased. But over the years, the opportunity to grow non-GMO soybeans, as I said, declined here, so that's really about the only choice we have. And now, all GMO soybeans are resistant to herbicides, and a lot of the weeds that we use to control in those soybeans with those herbicides are now also resistant to the herbicides. So there's a big clamor in farm country for new ways to control weeds because, frankly, glyphosate or Roundup, which is Monsanto's version of glyphosate, isn't as effective on weeds anymore. I would say the advantage for soybean farmers really lies in developing new markets and taking advantage of the fact that a lot of people want to buy the non-genetically modified products. That's showing up in spotty places all around.
Richard, I'm puzzled when you say you do GMO soy because that's the only market. What do you mean by that? You mean the buyers of your soy insist on GMO soy? Can you clarify that? I've never heard a farmer put it that way.
Well, it's basically a competitive advantage. If we grew the non-GMO soybeans, we would deliver them into the same markets that we deliver the GMO soybeans into. And for non-GMO soybeans to be competitive today, they need to collect a little bit of a premium because there aren't many new non-GMO seeds available. A lot of that are old hybrids, old genetics that may not be quite as competitive, but we also have to do more steps to control weeds because it's not as easy to grow soybeans that are non-GMO these days because all the herbicides that are available to us are focused on the resistant soybeans. So it's a little more cumbersome way to farm, but it is rewarded in some parts of the country where they have markets and they recognize the non-GMO soybean and pay a little more money for it.
So as I understand it, it really relates to the seeds and how they relate to the weeds and not to the preferences of consumers in their home, right? It's not that. Now, so where do you stand on labeling GMO crops, which most people, according to polls all over the country, they want to go into supermarkets and they want to know whether they're buying GMO crops or non-GMO crops?
Well, one of the reasons we have competition issues is because some of the big corporations who control most of agriculture and most of what we do don't want to divulge anything about their business or the things we grow. And so they tend to stonewall that and say, well, there's no difference, and so you don't need to know, and we're just not going to tell you. But I think that the consumer's right. And I think that if we do more labeling, then what we're going to have is actually more markets and more opportunities for family farmers because they're going to react to those better opportunities and those new markets where labels say this is non-GMO, this product is a certain thing, and this is good for you, or maybe it's bad for you, or maybe you just object to it. And so you get to make a choice, and that choice gives farmers opportunity.
This is very interesting, listeners, because you're really getting deep into how the Monsanto and other seed oligopolists operate. Let me elaborate that a bit with you, Richard. When you sign a contract with the seed company, I take it you probably buy seeds from Monsanto through a local distributor, but I've seen the contract that farmers have to sign with Monsanto. It's very one-sided. I mean, Monsanto has no responsibility, they avoid liability, and it's all on the back of the farmers. Do you sign those contracts? Could you describe them briefly?
If you grow a patented seed, you sign the contract, or the patented seed's not made available to you. So yes, every farmer is required to do that, and there aren't many choices not to. And that's one of the areas where I think our government, maybe our Department of Justice, just doesn't seem to see a problem with that. But what I've seen over the years is this overreaching control by corporations who sell things to farmers. seems to just take over everything. And looking back over close to 50 years that I've spent on the farm, working on the farm, actually being a farmer, I have to say that things have really changed from what they were at the beginning when farmers were a very independent lot. And most of the farmers I know back 40 or 50 years ago would have looked at a paper like that, wadded it up, and thrown it on the ground. But today, if you want to be a farmer, you sign the paper.
And that's because the seeds are patented monopolies by companies like Monsanto. We have urged the Antitrust Division of the Justice Department, Richard, for years to look into this growing seed monopoly. As you know better than I, the seed companies, the giant ones, have been buying up the little ones. So now you have a huge percent of the market controlled by Monsanto and a couple other companies. And explain, if you as a farmer go to a distributor of seeds, is it true that it's hard sometimes to buy non-GMO seeds because of the Monsanto network, the kind of incentives they provide the distributors, how they tie them up? Could you explain that?
Well, most seed companies or seed reps, let me say too that the seed I buy, the people I deal with are people right here in my community. They are friends. Some of them are actually farmers. A lot of farmers are seed dealers. Mm-hmm. And so that's one of the ways that seed corporations basically put off any sort of farmer revolt, is because they have us dealing with our neighbors every day instead of directly with them. But
the problem is, and we see this in India, by the way, where Indian farmers are in an uproar, as you know, because they used to trade seeds. It's a long-time tradition with their neighboring farmers. And now they're being pressured to buy patented seeds controlled by Western multinationals. And the farmers, and there's a lot of problem in Indian farm country out in Southeast Asia, suicides, crushing debt. They're saying they can't get the old seeds anymore. So I'm asking, is this true in farm country USA? Because this is an antitrust issue. And you're a great communicator about farm country, and we want to enlist your support with the Justice Department. And Secretary Vilsack, he was formerly a tort lawyer. I mean, he should know what monopolies are like. And so we want to get something going there. And so one of the aspects of developing a case against Monsanto is that they're squeezing your choice through a variety of unfair practices from getting traditional seeds.
Sure. One of the tools that they've used in the past has been cross-pollination. It's possible for a genetically modified soybean to cross with a non-genetically modified soybean. The pollen can be transferred by insects or by wind, not so much with soybeans with the wind, but certainly by bees and insects doing what they do. And cross-pollination does happen, however it occurs. And once that gene is into my crop, I can't claim innocence or ignorance of its presence. I'm subject to being sued by Monsanto if they discover that gene in my crop, even though I didn't buy their seed and I'm not taking advantage of whatever advantage they say it has. So it's made it almost impossible for a farmer not to pay the technology fee to Monsanto and honor that patent fee, because they've proven in the past, by suing a number of farmers who they've accused of stealing their genes, they proved in the past that they won't give anybody a buy on that. Everybody is held up to twist in the wind if Monsanto discovers their seeds or their genes on your farm.
Just think, listeners, this is the ultimate corporate predatory practice. Here's what Richard Oswald is talking about. If a farmer buys GMO seeds from Monsanto, plants the crops, corn, soybean, and the winds and insects take the pollination and migrate to another farm nearby and contaminate the traditional seeds, this is not by the will of the other farmer. Monsanto will sue the other farmer saying, you're taking our property and you're not paying royalties. And they actually did this in a celebrated case, as you know, Richard, in Canada, where the farmer really fought back. But the Department of Agriculture is supposed to enforce separation lands between farms with GMO seeds and farms without GMO seeds. USDA, in response to farmers who say, we don't want to use GMO seeds, but we can't help it because it's migrating from neighboring farmers, they require the GMO farmers to have a little bit of land, sort of a separation barrier. Is that being enforced? And describe the width of this so-called band that's supposed to protect against migration.
Well, actually, GMO farmers aren't required to have any separation barrier. GMO farmers have been, in the case of corn, have been required to plant a certain percentage of non-GMO corn along with their GMO corn to avoid insect resistance, because corn also has a gene that causes certain insects that feed on corn, to die when they eat the corn.
Yes.
And so resistance by those insects has been a big thing, and they've required corn farmers to plant what they call refuge, which is non-GMO corn that the insects will feed on and not become resistant to. Now, organic farmers are required to have a pullback area to keep their fields isolated from all the other fields to prevent that contamination. But here's the way I look at it. In the case of a cattle producer, for instance, a rancher or a farmer who grows cattle, and he has cows, and to have cows, you have to have a bull. And so what Monsanto says is that if that gene crosses the fence onto an organic farmer's land, that's their gene. But in cattle country, if a bull jumps the fence and leaves one farmer's cows and goes to another farmer's cow and impregnates the cow, that calf belongs to the farmer who owns the cow. So if you'd apply the same logic to the way Monsanto does it, a predatory farmer could turn 100 bulls out so that they all got in with his neighbor's cattle, breed all his neighbor's cows, and then claim all his neighbor's calf crop. You see the difference there?
That's a great analogy. It's part of the double standard of the way individuals are treated under U.S. law compared to the privileges and immunities of corporations. Just recently, Richard, you wrote a letter called The Fight for Labeling in the newsletter for the Organization for Competitive Markets, OCM.org, for those of you who are interested. And you referred to the overwhelming support of the American people who want to know country of origin for the meat that they are asked to buy in the supermarkets. They want to know whether the pork or the beef is imported from Canada, from Japan, from Brazil, from Mexico, or produced in the U.S. The Congress duly, some years ago, passed a law saying, yeah, there has to be country of origin labeling for shoppers in supermarkets. And then Brazil and Mexico took the USA to court under the World Trade Organization trade agreement in Geneva, Switzerland, and they beat us. And so the House of Representatives, in an almost panic, saying, oh, no, we don't want to have the taxpayer pay billions of dollars in damages that Mexico and Brazil are going to claim, now that they won the issue, that country of origin labeling is a non-tariff trade barrier and violates the World Trade Organization agreement, panicked and almost immediately, a few weeks ago, passed a bill overriding their own law of country of origin. Now it's in the Senate. And now, with that background, Richard, explain your case.
Well, the problem with being a farmer in America today is maintaining an identity. You know, and this country is growing bigger every year, and food comes from so many places, and most of it comes from a corporate origin, so that people are acquainted with branding and labels of corporations more than they are the label of the American farmer and where their food comes from and how it's produced. And with that knowledge of where the food comes from and how it's produced, comes safety, security, the ability to make a choice. And it also results in something we just spoke about earlier, is about markets for family farmers, opportunities to stay on the land and raise our families here and do what our country really needs us to do. But what this denial of country of origin labeling does is it threatens to take away that, and it forces us to accept the fact that our product can be blended in with a whole bunch of other products that comes from who knows where, which could really impact the cleanliness of it and the safety of it. And it certainly does impact the ability of the U.S. farmer and rancher to make a living, to sell their product for a price that they deserve, that allows them to sustain themselves and buy a lot of other products that are also American products, because farmers and ranchers are consumers too. We buy a lot of machinery, a lot of other inputs that help us do what we do. So we have a value to this country two ways. We grow food and we buy things.
You know, this is a very good explanation, listeners, that this labeling is not just for you. This labeling protects the identity of family farmers who are producing goods for you, and not blurs it when they repeal it into some massive global array of products. And you don't know whether it's coming from dirty meat plants that aren't inspected in Mexico or Brazil, or what kind of contamination, or indeed whether it's actually beef meat instead of partly horse meat, or who knows what. So you might want to contact your senators here and say you got one last chance to block this bill that passed the House and stand up for family farmers and consumers. You know, there was an editorial, Richard, in some trade publication years ago, maybe 10 years ago, that said it won't be long before there'll be 9 giant vertically and horizontally integrated agribusiness controlling the production, distribution, processing of food in America. Well, we got news for them. There's a fast-growing farmer-to-market business. I know all over the country. There are now 8,000 of them, and they're growing because people want local fresh food. And so that's a good development. But in the poultry area, which is what I want to ask you about, in the newsletter that I mentioned, and we're talking with Richard Oswald, fifth-generation Missouri farmer, who is a great communicator using social media around the country and the world. In this newsletter, there's an article by Willie Nelson, the singer, and Congresswoman Marcy Kaptur, called U.S. Poultry Farmers' Rights Under Siege. And this is really a grisly article because poultry farmers are the closest to medieval serfdom in the American economy of any segment of the economy. The giant poultry processors like Purdue and Tyson Foods, they actually, through contract farming, have driven these poultry farmers who actually grow the chickens up against the wall. Tell our listeners how much the poultry farmers who grow the chickens make per chicken compared to what the processors make for chicken before it hits the food table of you, the consumer.
The farmer who actually does the work, who has the poultry on his land the longest, and in possession of it the longest, may only make about 30 cents a bird. But the processor he grows it for makes more than 10 times that much. So what we've seen is that these contracts that poultry growers are subjected to, and that hog producers in this country being more and more subjected to, take away more and more of their profit and the opportunity to profit, while those farmers who do the work have to construct the buildings, they have to supply the land, they can have $1 million investment or more easily in what they do. And once they sign that contract, it's normally for a term of, say, 10 years. And the company that they're contracting with can mandate that they have to make improvements to those buildings or even build new buildings even before that 10-year contract is up. And it's sort of an unending cycle of debt for those folks. And they really have no recourse because the federal government has not really stepped into this in a meaningful way to put an end to these kinds of abuses that farmers are subjected to.
Describe what it's like inside these giant factory farm chicken farms. How crowded is it?
Well, normally, the birds come in and they're pretty small when they go in. Barns are constructed and they're called poultry barns. Barns are constructed to hold a set number of birds, and they come in small, of course, and they grow very quickly over a period of about 30 days. And the barn becomes fuller and fuller. And of course, the heat is oppressive inside if ventilation isn't adequate. That's one of the jobs that the farmer has, is to be sure that the birds are comfortable, and he has to maintain that barn. It gets dustier and dustier as time goes on because the barn is never cleaned until the birds go out. So the birds are, pooping on the floor, and there's sawdust or wood chips, bedding of some kind on the floor to help absorb that. And the farmer is generally subjected to exposure to that dust over his entire working life, because if that's what he does, he's in and out of those barns. So there are a lot of detrimental health effects for poultry farmers the way that's done.
Although Purdue has just announced they're not going to continue therapeutic use of antibiotics in the feed for these chickens, there's still a lot of antibiotics that's getting in consumer bodies, right, by eating these chickens from around the country, industrial chickens?
Well, it's hard to tell because I'm not sure that anyone actually tests for that. And we have to take those corporations' word. And it's not the farmer who formulates the feed, it's the corporation. The farmer doesn't even touch the feed. Normally, the corporation supplies the farmer with the feed, brings it to his farm, puts it in a holding tank where its conveyors carry it into the birds. And so even the farmer doesn't really know what it is he's given to the birds.
Could the farmers leapfrog Tyson and Purdue and reach the consumer developing their own distribution network. And if they want to do it, is there any agricultural credit in the USDA world that can help with that? Anybody trying to do that? To try to leapfrog the giant processors, perform like a co-op, like a processing poultry co-op.
Well, let me tell you something interesting. We've had a lot of co-ops. Farmers Union is one of the primary priorities of Farmers Union is promoting and building co-ops.
Yes.
So that farmers can get together and through cooperative financing or cooperative marketing or cooperative livestock production. Two of the biggest co-ops in the state of Missouri, MFA, Missouri Farmers Association, had a hog co-op. That's owned by Cargill. Farmland Industries, even bigger than MFA, was headquartered in Kansas City. That's owned by Smithfield. Smithfield is owned by the Chinese. Cargill is about to sell their hog operation to JBS, the Brazilians. So there's two of the largest Missouri and most successful at one time Missouri cooperatives that are now either owned or about to be owned by foreign countries.
Imagine producer co-ops being bought by giant corporations. I mean, American history has never seen this. This is going to be a big political issue. I hope Bernie Sanders will raise it when he campaigns in Missouri and throughout farm country. I think we've got to be very alert to this. The quality and safety of your food, folks, as consumers, is extremely dependent on the survival of family farmers. And we've seen enough in the newspapers, and you've read it in the newspapers, what happens when these giant multinationals control the food. They're not that interested in health, safety. They're not interested in preserving the land. It's just an accounting entry in their global profit books. So I hope that you'll stay in touch with Richard Oswald. As we conclude, Richard, can you give our listeners the website so they can reach you and they can read what you write every week?
The website is dailyyonder.com, and you can find it with a quick web search. And there's a lot of rural information, not just from me, but a whole lot of other rural writers that does a really good picture of painting what's good about rural America and the problems that we face.
dailyonder.com. And before we conclude, a quick question from you, David.
Well, I wanted to ask you about the Farm Bill. They pass one every 5 years. Are we finding fewer family farms every 5 years? Is it getting harder and harder to be a subsistence farmer in this country?
I guess the shorter answer is yes. We've become a lot more industrialized in our farming practices, and we have a lot more big farms, but we also have something in the state of Missouri and other states is we have a lot of farm kids, and we have a lot of people who just long to be on the land and to be involved in food production. And that's one of the reasons why Missouri is the second largest beef producing state in the nation, is because we have these little 20 and 30 cow herds that people just refuse to give up. They want to be a farmer. They want to grow food. They want to work with animals, and they want to raise their kids in the country.
And there are more truck farmers near cities, aren't there, Richard, producing fruits and vegetables?
Sure. Missouri is the bigger cities in Missouri especially, and neighboring cities. I know I live close to Nebraska, and in Lincoln, Nebraska, and Omaha, Nebraska, it's the same as it is in Kansas City and St. Louis. There are large farmers markets. There's a lot of farm-to-consumer food being grown, and there's a lot of desire on the part of consumers to have access to that type of food.
On that note, Richard, I'm afraid we're really out of time. It's been great talking with you. I hope people will contact your website, and thank you very much. And keep up the fight. And anything we can do to help you in Washington and with the Justice Department, by all means, contact us.
Okay, Ralph. Nice to meet you and talk with you, and just keep talking. That'll help as much as anything.
For sure. Thank you, Richard.
We've been talking to the president of the Missouri Farm Union, Richard Oswald. Check out his column, View from the Cab, in the Daily Yonder, thedailyyonder.com. When we come back, we'll be talking to legendary nuclear activist Harvey Wasserman. But first, let's hear from the corporate crime reporter, Russell McIver.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Thursday, August 13, 2015. I'm Russell McIver. Bumblebee Foods will plead guilty and pay $6 million for willfully violating worker safety rules, causing the 2012 death of an employee who became trapped inside an industrial oven. The company will pay $3 million to replace all of their outdated tuna ovens with new ovens that are automated and will not ever require workers to set foot inside the superheated pressurized steam cookers. Bumblebee will pay $1.5 million in restitution to the family of the victim, Jose Molina. On October 11, 2012, Molina entered a 35-foot cylindrical oven as part of his job duties. co-workers were unaware that Melina was inside the oven when they loaded 12,000 pounds of canned tuna, inadvertently trapping the victim in the back of the oven. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Remember to subscribe to this program for free on iTunes or Stitcher. And if you've missed any of this episode on the radio, please go to our website, ralphnaderradiohour.com, and catch up on what you've missed on this or any of our other 71 programs, which are archived there. And while you're there, click on the link that will take you to Ralph Nader's latest book, Return to Sender, Unanswered Letters to the President, 2001 through 2015. Our next guest and Ralph go back a long way as fellow travelers in the fight against nuclear power. Harvey Wasserman is a journalist, author, and advocate for renewable energy. He writes widely on energy, the environment, history, election protection, and politics. In the early 80s, he helped organize Musicians United for Safe Energy, which resulted in the No Nukes concerts at Madison Square Garden and the No Nukes rally that took place in Battery Park in New York. Ralph was also part of the organizing and was one of the main speakers at that event. For well over 25 years after that, there was not one nuclear power plant permitted. That changed only recently, thanks to the Obama administration. Mr. Wasserman also hosts his own radio show called The Green Power and Wellness Hour with Harvey Wasserman. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Harvey Wasserman.
It's great to be with you. Thanks so much.
Good to have you on, Harvey. We shared many a platform, giant rallies during the Carter administration in Washington, New York, Madison Square Garden, as David pointed out. And until very recently, there hasn't been a new nuclear plant licensed and built since 1973. In fact, the number of nuclear plants has been going down in the last few years because a number of them have closed. Could you give our listeners a quick panorama of how many nukes there are, what percentage of electricity they provide, before we get into the grisly downside of nuclear power?
Well, there's 99 reactors left certified to operate in this country, Ralph, down from, in the 110s at some point. 5 have shut in the last couple of years, and we're looking at a number of reactors now on the brink of shutdown because they are completely uneconomical, certainly can't compete with renewable energy, which is in the early stages of perhaps the biggest post-industrial revolution in world history. I'm predicting that photovoltaic cells will be the biggest industry in the history of the world, surpassing even the internet. Panels are going on houses everywhere, and they're driving the reactor industry out of business. They're not fast enough for the health and safety of the world. I was in San Luis Obispo, California, over August 6th and 7th for the 70th commemoration of Hiroshima, and those 2 reactors are very much under fire. They're in violation of state water quality. In fact, the state of California could shut them down tomorrow if our old friend Jerry Brown would get off the stick here. So we have reactors all across the country. The bad news, of course, Ralph, is that they're getting increasingly dangerous because, just like old cars, they're falling apart and they are not being regulated in any way, shape, or form that would satisfy the needs of the public welfare, especially a reactor like Davis-Besse in Ohio, which has numerous problems, really should not be operating at all. The owner there is just hanging on by a string and, gouging the public and risking the public health.
Yeah, explain Davis-Besse, which came close to a meltdown. Tell the people how close it came to a meltdown a few years ago.
Well, you couldn't make this stuff up. As Yogi Berra said, they leaked boric acid onto the head of the internal pressure vessel in a shield there in the internals of the plant. They were within an eighth of an inch of a Chernobyl on the coast of Lake Erie, with Cleveland and directly downwind, the entire Great Lakes at great risk. And their response, the owners, was to just patch things up and cut holes in the containment and stick on a new top. It's been ridiculous. You wouldn't do that to a car that you were driving, for God's sakes, and they're getting away with it because our regulators are not regulators at all. They're just rubber stamps. We have a governor in Ohio who's giving the utility everything it wants. So we have done a great job, I believe, Ralph, over the 40 years of grassroots campaigning to keep the nuclear power industry well under the 1,000 reactors that Richard Nixon promised in 1974 but we still have 99 to deal with. Obama has let 4 into the construction zone in 2 each in South Carolina and Georgia, but they are financial disasters, and I'm predicting that they'll never actually operate.
Yeah, well, nuclear power just can't compete. It's only crony capitalism. It's government-guaranteed industry. They have government-guaranteed insurance called the Price-Anderson Act. They are bailed out constantly. They are subsidized constantly. And they're given privileges that are really staggering. We're going to get to one in a minute that's going to really shake up the listeners' equanimity. But I think it's fair to say that nuclear power today is uneconomic, it's unsafe, it's uninsurable, it's unfinanceable without a government guarantee. Wall Street will not provide loans to electric companies to build nuclear plants without a 100% taxpayer guarantee. And they're unprotectable in terms of sabotage. And yet, because of crony capitalism, they continue dwindling in number, fortunately, to provide, 20% of U.S. electricity?
Oh, it's dropping, Ralph. And, I'm in Los Angeles, and when I drive around now, I see panels going up on rooftops every corner. I love how these guys talk about a free market and how we need Adam Smith capitalism, and then they turn to the government repeatedly. They gouge the public for all these subsidies. Not a single nuclear plant in the world, really, and certainly not in the United States, would be operating if it weren't for the Price-Anderson Insurance Act, which you have said, which limits liability in case of major accident. And we've seen that kick in Japan, the Fukushima reactor disaster. Its owners have profited from this disaster. They have turned Fukushima into a profit center based on government bailout, which is on the American model, even though they continue to pour 300 tons of radioactive water into the Pacific Ocean every day.
Tokyo Electric is the company. Talk about Indian Point, 30 miles north of Manhattan in New York City on the Hudson River. The 2 reactors aging. Talk about that potential disaster.
People say nuclear power plants are a disaster waiting to happen. They're actually disasters in progress. And at Indian Point, we actually have the governor of the state, Andrew Cuomo, in court trying to shut it down because it would violate state water quality laws, and he's not getting anywhere. Every nuclear reactor in the country is in process of destroying our bodies of water, our oceans, our lakes, our streams. Indian Point is pouring hot, chemically treated water into the Hudson River every day. It slaughters billions of marine creatures every day, and yet the state can't get it shut. The state of California, by the way, has referred to Diablo Canyon as the Pacific Ocean's largest marine predator because it kills so much wildlife. And I have to say, by the way, we do have a great victory to celebrate. We did shut 2 reactors at San Onofre between L.A. and San Diego within the last couple of years, and we are really fiercely trying to get Diablo Canyon and all the other reactors shut. But, in California, there's this solar energy revolution, which Jerry Brown has helped along, has made Diablo Canyon completely extraneous to the energy mix. And that's the truth. That's the reality in virtually everywhere else in the United States.
Yes, in fact, solar panels are deep-sixing any prospect of nuclear power. And even though the Koch brothers, representing oil and gas interests, want to surcharge solar panels in state legislatures, they're losing because there's no such thing as a Republican or Democratic solar panel. They want that local business. They want those local jobs. And one thing about you, Harvey, and by the way, Harvey has written A People's History of the United States, which was introduced by no less a personage than Howard Zinn, who also wrote A People's History of the United States.
Yeah.
And Harvey, you've not only been a bastion against nuclear power, and try having anybody who's a pro-nuke debate Harvey Wasserman on this and survive.
Yeah, I love it.
You've been a great promoter of solar energy. Solartopia is the book that you wrote years ago. Give us a quantitative grasp now of how fast solar energy and wind power, solar thermal, solar photovoltaic, solar panels, etc., are spreading around the United States,
well,
and also jobs.
Well, here's a number for you. The California Solar Energy Association estimates that there are 55,000 people working in the solar industry in California alone. There are more people working in the solar industry in California than there are in coal mines in the entire United States. And we are waiting for the solar industry to finally kick in and join the fight with us to shut down these nuclear plants. The capacity at Diablo Canyon is 2,200 megawatts. That's a huge capacity that will be filled by tens of thousands of jobs when we get these reactors shut down. We'd like to see, Ralph, some arm twisting in the corporate headquarters of these solar companies to finally get them to help us at the grassroots and shut the rest of the nukes. And, we're really in a war here, a race against time here, because we know that many of these reactors are very close, even directly on earthquake faults. Since Diablo Canyon was built in the 70s, a dozen seismic fault lines have been found very close to the reactors. They are half the distance, Diablo Canyon, from the San Andreas fault that Fukushima was from the fault line that destroyed it.
How about Indian Point, right outside New York City?
Right on the Ramapo Fault. Actually, Indian Point is listed as being in the greatest danger of any American reactors from earthquake faults. But again, we have had our victories. We shut Vermont Yankee, we shut Crystal River, we shut Kewaunee, and other reactors. We're predicting this fall that a number more may go down, including the Clinton reactors in Illinois, for strictly economic reasons. They can no longer compete. And, Ralph, when you and I started with this movement way back when, we were asked what was going to replace nuclear, and we said, well, solar and wind. At the time, it was really just a baby technology, but our movement, the green power solar-topian movement, has spawned a $1 trillion industry. Hundreds of thousands of people who have jobs now that are clean, safe, well-paying jobs in the solar and wind industries that would not have existed had it not been for the grassroots anti-nuclear movement. So,
right.
But we have to go further. I'm terrified of what's happening at Fukushima. We're seeing rising thyroid cancer rates among children in the area. We're seeing terrifying die-offs of marine creatures in the ocean that look a hell of a lot like cesium-137 poisoning. We have to understand, to put this in perspective, the amount of radiation that has been released by Fukushima is hundreds of times greater than the amount of radiation that was released at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the same is true at Chernobyl. These technologies are lethal beyond people's greatest or worst imaginings, and we're seeing it now, and we really got to get these other reactors shut before disaster strikes again.
Example of what you're saying, how uneconomic nuclear is, there is these proposals to build new nukes in Florida, and the nuclear industry muscled the Florida legislature to start charging consumers who buy electricity an added amount of money every month to prepay the cost of building the nuclear plants before even the shovel was in the ground. It's called construction work in progress. Probably one of the most brazen impositions of corporate government collusive power I've ever seen. You want to describe that briefly?
Yeah, it's what they did at Seabrook, too, and elsewhere. They tried to get the public to pay for these things before a single electron of electricity moves through the wires. It's a total scam. Nuclear power has degenerated from an actual progress while they build a nuclear plant to just a Ponzi scheme. That's all it is, And when Crystal River shut in North Florida, they charged the ratepayers billions of dollars, even though no one ever voted on it. In fact, no single commercial reactor in the United States has ever been approved by a public vote specifically. So, this technology, which is a plague on our Earth, which cannot solve global warming, it's really annoying to see these people who are talking about global warming saying that nuclear power is going to help. But nuclear power is a disaster when it comes to climate chaos, or what I like to call global weirding, because it introduces huge quantities of heat. It does create greenhouse gases in the mining, milling, and enrichment process, as well as waste management, which is an impossibility anyway. And, we have the answer technologically, but the barriers of the Koch brothers, what I call King Kong, coal, oil, nukes, and gas, they're standing in the way to protect their investments. We're just going to have to win this.
Harvey, when I got into the anti-nuke movement in the early 70s, Dixie Lee Ray was the chair of the Atomic Energy Commission, which was then the regulator, so-called, but really the promoter of nuclear power plants around the country. And I called her professionally insane. Professionally. Because this is a clinically insane industry. Its only purpose is to boil water to produce steam. Its only purpose, the entire nuclear fuel cycle, with the poisons from the uranium mines and the tailings and the fuel rods and the nuclear plants and the radioactive waste and where you're going to put it and the risk of sabotage and the taxpayer guarantee and the insurance guarantee by the U.S. government, all to produce boiled water. I mean, this has to be one of the colossal insanities of all time. And as Amory Lovins has pointed out, nuclear power is being beaten all over the world by wind and solar energy. And by the way, Fukushima's residues have already reached the west coast of America, right?
Oh, yeah, way beyond that. I mean, it's a nightmare, a horrible nightmare. And you know, the nuclear power is designed to do one thing beyond boil water, which is to concentrate capital and wealth in the hands of a few speculators who are not held liable, as you pointed out, for the downwind disasters.
And they absorb no risk. The government takes the risk. You're the taxpayer.
Right. And if you really want to see, look at the financial fortunes of Tokyo Electric Power, which had 3 reactors blow up, for God's sakes. As you recall, Ralph, the industry, any time somebody would say a nuclear power plant was going to blow up, the industry would jump in and say, no, you're foolish. No reactor can ever explode. Well, Chernobyl exploded, and then they said, well, that's Russian reactors. And in Fukushima, we saw 3 General Electric reactors blow up. And we still think that Unit 3 may actually have been a fission explosion because there was a mushroom cloud there. And so, you know, one of the biggest lies ever told, along with this idea that nobody died at 3 Mile Island. And you may remember, Ralph, that Anna Mayo and I were 2 of the only reporters that went into central Pennsylvania after the accident to actually check and see if people were harmed. And I spent the worst week of my life interviewing people around that nuke in 1980. You know, cancers, leukemias, tumors that I could see. It is an unconscionable assault on the human race that these reactors continue to operate. So we're in a good spot now, and we finally turned it around, but we got to really move fast.
Yeah, and there were close calls in Browns Ferry nuclear plant in Alabama, the Fermi nuclear plant near Detroit, which launched the nuclear engineer who said we almost lost Detroit. Remember that one? Harvey.
We did indeed.
Yeah. Harvey, how can people reach you before we conclude?
My email is solartopia, SOLARTOPIA, @gmail.com. Write me directly. Look at the website, nukefree, NUKEFREE.org, which is sponsored by Bonnie Raitt, Jackson Brown, and Graham Nash. And get to your local organization. Find the nearest nuke next to you and shut it down. Believe me, it's happening all over the country, and our lives depend on it. And Ralph, you were the primary instigator. You did those critical mass conferences back in 74 and 75 to get this movement going. And everything we said about the dangers of nuclear power has proven out to be true.
Understated.
And then some.
Even understated.
That's right. So now we got to continue to move ahead and get this done. And we have the satisfaction of knowing that we've created all these millions of jobs. And it's not just in the U.S., it's worldwide. You know, if we can get this industry shut down in China and India and Russia as well, which is going to really have our work cut out for us, and maybe we'll have a planet to live on in the next few decades.
And Harvey Wasserman has a stake in posterity. He has 5 daughters, 4 grandchildren.
I have 5 daughters, 9 grandchildren.
And 9 grandchildren.
And, you know, I want to, it's our responsibility to make sure that these kids have a place to live and jobs, and everything that we have said to benefit the economy has also proven true. These guys who like to attack us and say we're anti-progress, it's completely the opposite. You know, the people pushing nuclear power are like the horse and buggy industry screaming about the automobile 100 years ago. They are the ones that are obsolete. We're the ones that chose the technologies that are going to move ahead, and now we got to clean up their mess before it kills us all.
Read Harvey's book, Solartopia. And by the way, he's written a book with Bob Fitrakis on how the GOP stole America's 2004 election in Ohio, where Harvey lives and works.
Well, I watched it happen. And you got to remember that electronic voting machines are perfectly designed to steal elections, and we're going to see it again in 2016. 80% of the votes cast and counted in the United States now are cast on electronic voting machines.
Before
when
we
you have when you have a state with the governor and secretary of state from the same party, as you do now in Ohio, Florida, Michigan, Iowa, and Arizona, key swing states, all controlled by Republican governors and secretaries of state, you have a situation for a clearly, easily stolen election. It can be doing about 10 seconds for them to flip the vote. So people need to look at that issue. Bob and I are writing another book on that, which we hope to have out in the fall, winter, called The Fifth Jim Crow, about how our 2016 election can be stolen. And Ralph, you'll be glad to know I'm writing another people's history based on a cycles approach to U.S. history, and having a lot of fun with it. I'll probably be out next year.
Harvey, you are a force of history yourself. Thank you very much for coming on the program. We'll continue this in the future and make sure Bernie Sanders comes out powerfully against nuclear power.
Yeah, we need that. Well, we shut the one in Vermont, so we'll have to shut the rest of them too.
Good. Thanks very much, Harvey.
Thanks so much, Ralph. It's always an honor to talk to you. You are the greatest, and you continue to be an inspiration. So let's keep doing it.
We've been talking to journalist, activist, radio host, and survivor of 5 daughters, Harvey Wasserman. Go to, I don't know how you did it, sir. I have one.
Wonderful kid.
Go to Nuke Free.
I highly recommend if you're going to have children, have girls.
Go to nukefree.org to find out more about Harvey's work. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, Ralph Nader will answer more of your Facebook questions.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
From Pacifica, you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, www.nader.org.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. If you would like to have a question answered by Ralph Nader, go to Facebook, like Ralph Nader's Facebook page, and then you can ask a question that will be answered like the following. Laura Sapero writes, Ralph Nader, which oil company is the most reputable? Or rather, which oil company is the least evil? I live in an area where public transportation isn't a viable option currently.
David, I've never been asked that kind of question. I don't think that there's an answer. They all have to toe the same industry imperatives, oil companies, big and small. I suppose if they're smaller, they're less able to do damage globally. But as long as the question is asked, do you know that there are farmer oil co-ops? And back in the 1920s, the U.S. farmers started their own oil wells, their own oil refineries, and their gas stations in farm country. And they were owned by the farmers. And at one point, they were about 1% of U.S. oil production and refining. So I suppose the answer to your question would be the farmer-owned oil companies.
Okay, but when you're driving down the street and you have to fill up, we all go through this. You see Mobil and you go, well, they're Exxon, so you can't do that, Valdez. And then you see BP and you can't do that. Who do you choose? Shell? Then Shell destroyed Nigeria. Which oil company are you most comfortable stopping at?
Well, a lot of progressives choose Citgo, which is owned by the Venezuelan government and which had economic activities with Joe Kennedy when he was importing oil for heating purposes and giving poor people a break on their heating bills.
The grandson of Joe Kennedy.
That's right. And the former member of Congress in the House. So Citgo is the gas station that people often are attracted to.
Leela Gary writes, Mr. Nader, thank you for writing a caustic letter to our Prime Minister, Stephen Harper. I guess this comes from Canada. My question is, how can you think that the general public would ever be able to overcome unfettered capitalism if there is no end to the machinations and influence on government? Capitalism is inherently strong and socialism inherently weak. It has been such throughout history under different names and actors involved.
I think, Leila Gary, there's an insight in your question. It's quite interesting. When you said capitalism is strong, socialism is weak. A main reason for that is this. When capitalism collapses, as it did in Wall Street in 2008, it was socialism out of Washington that saved it. But when socialism in the Soviet Union collapsed, There's no capitalism interested in saving it. That's the difference. That's why capitalism has such a survival stamina, because there's always socialism to bail it out, to subsidize it, to rescue it, when it's consummate greed among the giants on Wall Street and the banks get the entire country in a downward economic spiral with millions of jobs lost, as occurred after 2008, and trillions of dollars lost in worker pensions and small saver mutual funds. I think the other answer to your question is, when the people get strong enough to control Congress, then capitalism will never be unfettered. And there is a difference between small capitalism, little stores on Main Street, and giant corporate capitalism, which really isn't capitalism, because the definition of capitalism is that it's controlled by its owners. Stockholders don't control the big corporations, and that if it fails, it goes bankrupt, obeying the verdict of the market, and big corporations don't go bankrupt when they can go to Washington for a bailout. So you might want to use the term big capitalism when you make the point in your question. Thank you.
When the next crisis happens and the federal government has to own the banks and maybe own other corporations, do you think both sides of the aisle are going to be comfortable with keeping that ownership and not giving it back to the companies they saved?
Well, they may create new banks out of whatever government takeover there is, because these banks are too big to fail. The government in 2008, under George Bush, no less, was considering nationalizing the big banks. They couldn't figure a way to save them without, in effect, assuming all their liabilities in the form of nationalized banks. But if they did, they wouldn't give it back to the same old crew. They would recapitalize them and float them as new banks.
And both sides would be comfortable with that, right?
Well, new banks and, new shareholders. Yeah.
Well, that does it for us. If you'd like to ask Ralph Nader a question, all you have to do is go to his Facebook page, like that Facebook page, and ask away. I want to remind you to go to nader.org and sign up for Ralph's weekly column, which will be delivered to your email box for free once a week. Let's thank our guests today, Richard Oswald, president of the Missouri Farmers Union. Go to dailyyonder.org to find out more. And also thanks to Harvey Wasserman. Find out more about Harvey's work on renewable energy at nukefree.org. Don't forget to pick up a copy of Ralph's book, Return to Sender, Unanswered Letters to the President, 2001 to 2015. And for more of Russell McIver, go to corporatecrimereporter.com. And if you have missed any of this or any other episodes, go to ralphnaderradiohour.com. Thank you for joining us.
And thank you, listeners. Spread the word and get active.